Number 6. P-47. There are a few reports of captured P-47 Thunderbolt aircrafts being used by the German Air Force. One, operated by U.S. 2nd Lieutenant William E. Roach, made an emergency landing on a German airfield on November 7, 1943. The pilot was taken prisoner, and the Thunderbolt was given the German markings T9LK, likely for reconnaissance over England prior to D-Day. The Americans seized it when they took over the airport where it was being kept. At least 2 other captured P-47s were used by the Germans as well for reconnaissance, testing, and propaganda. Number 5. 1999 F-117A shootdown. On March 27, 1999, the Army of Yugoslavia's 3rd Battalion of the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade, led by Colonel Zoltan Dani, shot down an F-117A aircraft during the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. The pilot ejected and was recovered by rescue crews. This was the only incident in which an F-117 was taken down. The United States Air Force designed the aircraft in the 1970s, entered service in 1983, and was publicly unveiled in 1988. It was widely regarded as one of the most sophisticated pieces of U.S. military weaponry when it first saw battle over Panama in 1989. Yugoslavian air defenses were viewed at the time as being mostly out of date. Several missiles were launched at around 8:15 p.m. local time with a range of approximately 8 miles. According to Sergeant Dragan Matic, the soldier who fired the missiles detected the F-117 at a range of roughly 31 to 37 miles, operating their equipment for no more than 17 seconds to prevent being locked on by NATO anti-air suppression. In a 2007 interview, Dani stated that his forces noticed the aircraft on radar when its bomb bay doors opened, boosting its radar signal. Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, a veteran of Operation Desert Storm, piloted the F-117. He saw the launch of 2 missiles and their approach to his plane. The first one passed close enough to create buffeting, but didn't detonate. The second missile, on the other hand, did detonate, causing substantial damage to the aircraft and forcing it to spiral out of control. As the airplane plummeted, Zelko was subjected to high G-forces and struggled to assume the proper ejection stance. He utilized his survival radio to transmit a mayday call when his parachute released and was able to reach a KC-135 that had witnessed him shot down. Zelko used his survival radio while still descending, reasoning that the altitude would provide the best potential range for his transmission. He was certain he would be apprehended by Serbian forces on the ground and wanted to ensure he was unharmed before they got to him. Zelko landed in a field south of Ruma and quickly hid in a drainage ditch. There, he experienced the shockwaves caused by American bombs dropped by B-2 bombers on targets near Belgrade. Despite a huge search conducted in the region by the Serbian army, police, and local residents, he remained unnoticed. The next morning, he was recovered by a combat search and rescue team from the United States Air Force. A second F-117A supposedly suffered damage during the same mission on April 30th, and although it made it back to base, it never flew again, according to sources. On May 2, 1999, the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade also shot down a USAF F-16 fighter. These were the only 2 victories out of dozens of ground-to-air missiles fired throughout the conflict. Some F-117 debris has been kept at the Serbian Museum of Aviation in Belgrade, while other components have been shipped to Russia for use in developing anti-stealth technology. The F-117 was decommissioned by the United States Air Force in 2008. Number 4. USSR captured American aircraft. During the Korean War of the early 1950s, the Soviet MiG-15 and American F-86 Sabre fighter jets were essentially on par with each other. Both sides attempted to seize one another's planes, but only the USSR succeeded. In April 1951, Lieutenant Colonel Zhubenko led a crew of test pilots to North Korea. Their mission was to force land an F-86 at a North Korean airport. The group's operation was a failure, and the Sabre was quickly captured by the Soviets. On October 6 the same year, Soviet pilot Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Pepelev caused such precise damage to an American jet that it landed on the North Korean shore almost unharmed. The U.S. pilot was apprehended by a U.S. Air Force search and rescue team, but the plane was confiscated and sent to Moscow. The Soviet Union decided to replicate the killer of MiGs, as the F-86 was dubbed in the Western press. Stalin gave a year to the designer Vladimir Kondratyev to develop a Soviet Sabre. However, Kondratyev failed in his duty and the project was abandoned following Stalin's death. In the end, it was agreed to borrow individual captured fighter units, components, and materials for use in the Soviet aircraft business. To capture a MiG-15, the Americans launched Operation Moolah on November 1, 1950, promising a substantial prize to North Korean pilots who defected to South Korea aboard functional planes. However, the procedure failed. On September 21, 1953, after the war had already ended, defector No Kum Sok landed a MiG-15 at the Kimpo Air Base near Seoul. 6 of the United States' newest F-11 Aardvark jet bombers arrived in Vietnam on March 17, 1968. The North Vietnamese called this aircraft Whispering Death due to its ability to approach unexpectedly and near silently, attack quickly, and vanish without a trace. The Aardvark was first seen by Soviet intelligence personnel during the Paris Air Show in Le Bourget in the spring of 1967. Even though it was under the close supervision of U.S. military police, Soviet operatives managed to take many pictures of it from different perspectives. The most difficult and vital work, however, had still to be completed, researching the aircraft's insides. In truth, the Whispering Death was not as frightening as it appeared. Only a few weeks after their arrival in Vietnam, 2 Aardvark aircrafts were shot down by the Vietnamese People's Army's air defense troops, while another was seized and delivered to the Soviet Union. There are various stories of how the Aardvark was captured. According to one of them, the F-111 was drowned out. In other words, its communications with its base were disrupted, while a Soviet pilot in a fighter jet pushed the U.S. plane to the ground and forced it to land at an airstrip in North Vietnam. Others, however, disagree that the Soviet Union had the technological capability to jam the radio signals of a U.S. airliner. According to this view, the pilots were simply paid and cut off connections with their base. Overall, the Soviet Union gained a lot of trophies from the Vietnam War. Not only did they obtain the F-111, but Moscow also obtained an F-4, an A-37, and an F-5E aircraft, CH-47A Chinook helicopters, an AIM-7 Sparrow missile, and hundreds of other pieces of American military gear. Number 3. FW-190. On June 1, 1939, the prototype FW-190 Vöger aircraft went into service. The nimble and fast aircraft soon impressed Luftwaffe leaders, and by the late 1940s they were visible on the front lines, though they did not participate in combat missions until August 1941. However, engine dependability concerns caused by overheating plagued FW-190 aircraft until the arrival of BMW engines in the spring of 1942. They were seriously evaluated for ground assault duties once the engine dependability issue was rectified. Because there were no liquid cooling systems that may be damaged in battle, the German Army thought they were an excellent contender for close ground support. The BMW radial engines were air-cooled. The strong and large undercarriage also made them excellent for landing and taking off from frontline airfields. When the British first faced FW-190 fighters, they had no clue they were dealing with a new type of aircraft. The British pilots mistook captured French fighters for hostile German aircraft, although the superior performance of the hostile German aircraft ultimately raised some concerns. The British were planning a commando-style attack to capture a Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft from a French base, eager to acquire the secrets of the new Luftwaffe's fighter. They were saved the hassle when a disoriented German pilot from 111 JG2 mistakenly landed his FW-190A3 fighter at RAF Pembrey in South Wales, UK, thinking it was an airfield in France. The captured aircraft was sent to the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, England, where it was determined during trials that the FW-190A was better in all areas except turning circle than the Spitfire VB, which was then used by the majority of RAF Fighter Command. Only after that, the British learned the Germans could outclass the ponderous Spitfire fighters with the FW-190. Germany provided Japan with a few FW-190 fighter of the A8 version for technical examination. The findings of the Japanese engineers' investigation were integrated into the design of the Ki-61 fighter. During the war, a total of 20,051 were supplied. Number 2. The Spitfire. The Spitfire MKVB, registration EN830, was one of the 12,129 Spitfires produced at Castle Bromwich. It was equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 45 engine, which gave the aircraft a top speed of 375 miles per hour, a range of 470 miles, a service ceiling of 35,000 feet, and heavy artillery of 220mm cannons and 4 .303-inch machine guns. The aircraft made its first flight on April 30, 1942, and was turned over to the No. 37 Maintenance Unit at RAF Burtonwood the following month on May 1, 1942. In early June 1942, he joined No. 131 Squadron and was assigned the squadron code NXX. At the time, they were situated at RAF Merston and were conducting offensive operations over northern France. On August 25, 1942, it was involved in a flying mishap, which caused the aircraft to be grounded for a long period of time. The weather that day delivered heavy overcast and poor visibility, excellent conditions for Fighter Command to launch rhubarb missions from RAF Westhampton, where No. 131 Squadron was based. A section of fighters and bombers flew over the English Channel, then flew beneath the clouds in search of targets of opportunity. The No. 131 Squadron would fly 2 rhubarbs, the first which would be flown by Pilot Officer Bernard Schildhauer in a Spitfire MKVB and Pilot Officer Henry de Bordas of the Free French Air Force. After taking off at 2:10 p.m. and flying over the water to France, they arrived at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, Cannes, before flying to Carentan, Normandy, where Pilot Officer Schildhauer attacked and destroyed a train. Pilot Officer DeBordis had been separated from Pilot Officer Schildhauer, whose aircraft had been struck by flak. He couldn't find him despite radio calls and circling the area. As he flew west, Pilot Officer Schildhauer was forced to land in a field on what he assumed was the Isle of Wight, but was really occupied by Jersey. Captured by the Germans and imprisoned in Stalag Luft 3, he would participate in the Great Escape alongside squadron leader Roger Bushall. They were killed by the Gestapo 4 days after they escaped, along with 48 other escapees. Bernard Schildhauer, a pilot officer, was born on August 18, 1921 and died on March 30, 1944. He was only 22 years old at the time. Despite the crash landing, the plane was still airworthy and was flown to the Luftwaffe's primary test airfield in Rechlin, Germany within a month of being captured. The code CJZY would be assigned to it, and it would be painted yellow and green. The Spitfire's 12-volt electrical system was replaced with the Luftwaffe's 24-volt system, its armament was removed, and its Rolls-Royce Merlin 45 engine was replaced with a Daimler-Benz DB605A engine. It was later sent to Echterdingen in Germany, where it was equipped with a propeller and a carburetor scoop from a Merschmidt Bf-109G. Because the Bf-109G used the same Daimler-Benz engine, comparative tests were conducted between both aircraft. Number 1. MiG-25 Foxbat. Despite being a skilled fighter pilot in one of the Soviet Union's finest squadrons with all the benefits that came with it, Viktor Belenko was sick of the shortages and propaganda that characterized most of life in the USSR. He was concerned that stories of abundance in the United States were likewise overstated, but he decided to take a risk. On September 6, 1976, on a regular training operation, he turned off his radio and flew to Japan's Hakodate Airport. He landed in Japan with only a shattered landing gear after nearly running out of fuel, narrowly missing a civilian aircraft and overshooting the runway. It turned out to be one of the great Cold War intelligence coups. Western spy services began to disassemble the aircraft, examining the fighter whose capabilities had previously been assumed. Afterward, on September 25, 1976, a U.S. Air Force C-5 Galaxy cargo plane flew the plane from Hakodate to Hayukari Air Force Base, and by then, analysts had concluded that the plane was an interceptor, not a fighter bomber, which provided great relief to Japanese defense strategists. When the Soviet Union sought its return, Japan agreed to return it only on the condition that the transport costs be reimbursed. The plane arrived in dozens of containers aboard a parked Soviet warship, and when the Soviets found at least 20 vital components were missing, they requested $10 million in compensation. Neither paid, which was rather becoming for the Cold War. The Soviet Air Force suffered severe losses as a result of his defection. Belenko was given refuge by U.S. President Gerald Ford, and a trust fund was established for him, allowing him to live well in later years. After his defection, the U.S. government debriefed him for 5 months and hired him as a consultant for several years. Belenko had carried the MiG-25 pilot's manual with him, expecting to aid U.S. pilots in examining and testing the aircraft. The MiG-25 Foxbat was the Soviet Union's most recent and sophisticated fighter. The United States and its NATO allies were legitimately concerned about its capabilities, and it was widely considered to be a sophisticated fighter bomber capable of outflying anything NATO possessed. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The MiG-25 was innovative in its own right. It was one of the fastest fighters ever built, with a potential peak speed of Mach 3.2 at the risk of engine damage, placing it on par with the legendary SR-71 espionage plane from the US. It had one of the most powerful radars ever installed on a plane of its size. However, the MiG-25 was developed primarily to intercept US high-altitude surveillance aircraft within Soviet territory. It couldn't carry ground attack weapons, didn't have an integrated cannon, and the huge wings that NATO understood as making it a deadly dogfighter were only needed to keep its hefty airframe aloft. In truth, it was nimble and, once close to short range, would be dead meat in traditional combat. Even though the plane had shortcomings, the Soviet Union produced over 1,000 of them, and they were extensively exported to a number of nations, where their combat record in multiple wars was at best mediocre. Later, an improved version known as the MiG-31 was constructed that had many similarities with the original, including many of its flaws.
8. Anti-Tank Dog. The most brutal fighting was seen by the Eastern Front during World War II. New tactics had to be developed in order to defend themselves against the German threat, and so anti-tank dogs were trained as a result. The Russians were well known for their ability to mass-produce cheap equipment, and because of the ever-evolving combat from the early 20th century, military tanks were becoming a giant threat. The Red Army came up with a plot to use their foes' advantages against them, and in 1924, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics introduced the use of dogs as military assets on the battlefield. Training dogs seemed easy enough, and they could be used for a myriad of different purposes, such as rapid communication, assisting in combat, first aid, tracking mines, extracting wounded soldiers with the use of sleds, and transporting certain supplies. However, the biggest menace to the Red Army was tanks, and these new military-grade K9s were expertly trained to assist in taking down these metal behemoths. Since this technique was never done before, the Russian army lacked personnel capable of completing such feats. A campaign was started in order to enlist the help of any person with dog training experience, and once they had enough recruits, practice began in Moscow. German Shepherds were the main breed used for this mission because they were so easy to train, and a mine vest was developed to fit on the animal. The initial plan for these anti-tank dogs was to run under enemy tanks and detach mines from their vest, which would be detonated remotely, before returning to their trainers. But as you know, things don't always go according to plan. The new weapons were first deployed around mid-1941, but the dogs were squirmish on the battlefield, having never been around gunfire before, which made it extremely difficult for them to complete their task. The K9s were also trained using Soviet tanks and were not used to the German design, so they gravitated towards leaving mines under the more familiar Soviet tanks instead, which was obviously extremely dangerous for the Red Army. With limited success, the use of the anti-tank dog significantly decreased and completely phased out of practice by 1966. 7. Rotterdam Blitz. During the German invasion of the Netherlands in the Second World War, Rotterdam was highly targeted by aerial bombardment from the Luftwaffe. The prime objective was to break Dutch resistance as well as support the German troops on the ground that were fighting in the city. On May 10, 1940, the first bombing took place, and by May 14th, Rotterdam's historic city centre had been completely destroyed. The terrible event is sometimes referred to as the Rotterdam Blitz, which resulted in the deaths of at least 1,150 people. 711 of those deaths were from the bombing on the 14th of May. On top of the casualties, at least 85,000 residents were left homeless. From the Germans' perspective, they'd done everything they sought out to do, and the bombing was a physical and psychological success for them during World War II. This prompted them to threaten the destruction of the entire city of Utrecht if the Dutch did not surrender. Too many losses and the fear of even more devastation caused the Dutch to sign the capitulation early on May 15, 1940. 6. Sky Troopers. From the beginning of the Nazi regime, the Germans were always fascinated with engineering and science, and they worked tirelessly so that their military was superior to anyone who could oppose them. They used science as a way to control the world they planned to take by force. The Germans' drive to be number one in everything resulted in some seriously terrifying experiments, as well as some absurd technology being developed. However, most Nazi science was focused on the creation of weapons of war. Rocketry was one of the Germans' biggest areas of innovation during World War II. One of the more lesser-known inventions was known as the Himmelstürmer flight pack. This small two-jet engine machine was created by Paul Schmidt, an engineer for the Nazi regime. The main engine was strapped to the back of the wearer to provide upward and forward propulsion, while the second engine used hand grips in order to control stability and direction. Uses for this jetpack were endless. However, they opted for these Himmelstürmer troops to wear normal German military uniforms and carry guns and grenades like any other soldier. Imagine flying figures crossing enemy lines and striking down on unsuspecting victims from the sky. The Allies wouldn't stand a chance, but luckily, Himmelstürmer never actually saw service. The test flights only covered distances of about 50 to 70 meters, 164 to 230 feet, and due to fuel limitations, longer trips weren't really possible. By the flight pack's test phase, the war was turning against the Germans and their resources were running thin. All available soldiers were needed on the front lines, and the Nazis' jetpack fantasy came to a close end towards the end of the war. Did you know the Nazis basically invented the first jetpack? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Code Talkers. During World War II, the US military began to recruit American Indians for secret communication purposes. Since the American Indians were able to speak fluently in both English and their tribal language, they were the perfect candidates to help the US send private communications while on the battlefield. There were at least 14 native nations aiding in the war, including Navajo, Comanche, and Cherokee tribes. During World War II, a dedicated policy was put into place in order to recruit and train American Indian code talkers. In 1940, the US Army was the very first branch of the military to begin recruiting Native Americans in places like Oklahoma. The US Navy and Marines followed in their footsteps and began recruiting just a few years later. The first group to complete training from the US Marines was a class of 29 Navajo code talkers in 1942. They didn't just go through basic training, they also had to memorize a unique military code, mostly using their unwritten language, and they were hidden out of sight in guarded rooms until they had it down. The help of hundreds of code talkers played a vital role in the victory of the Allies in World War II, and the whole program was kept a secret from the public until it was declassified in 1968. For their bravery, Congressional Gold Medals were given to the code talkers in 2001. 4. Ichy Powder. Interestingly, Ichy Powder played a small role in taking down German forces during the Second World War. Secret services and British intelligence were some of the best in the business when it came to spying, and they used a number of tactics in order to carry out their dastardly plans. Trickery and deception were used quite frequently, and a lot of the time, Germans were completely unaware of their secret agendas. Their operations would often include an intricate network of spies, advanced technology, double agents, and of course, a good amount of luck. One operation in particular really got under the skin of the Nazi regime, literally. I'm talking about extremely potent itching powder. This dust was developed by the British Special Operations Executive, and it was smuggled into Germany from Switzerland in tins of foot powder. Once across enemy lines, special Allied forces working in laundromats would sprinkle this stuff all over military uniforms, which caused extreme skin irritation. About 25,000 soldiers aboard an enemy Navy U-boat in October of 1943 were hospitalized with cases of severe dermatitis after double agents sprinkled the powder on their bedding, toilet paper, and underwear. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that would have been? 3. World War II Cannibals. Former President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief George H.W. Bush narrowly escaped getting eaten alive after his plane had been shot down over the island of Chichijima in Japan. It was September 2, 1944, when the future president, only 18 years old at the time, served as an officer in the Navy and was sent on a mission to fly in a strike over Japan. He was told to take out an important radio tower on the island of Chichijima, a stronghold that was heavily guarded. Bush, along with 2 other servicemen, were aboard the aircraft when they had to eject themselves to stay alive after being hit by Japanese fire. Luckily, before strapping on their parachutes, they were able to complete their mission and destroyed the communication tower before escaping their burning plane. Bush narrowly escaped the fate of the 9 other soldiers who also had to eject from their planes. He had become separated from the rest of the group and had been picked up by a large American submarine that had miraculously been nearby. It was found out later that the other men had been captured by the Japanese and were tortured, beaten, beheaded, and some of them were even eaten by the enemy soldiers. Apparently, according to the Telegraph, a British newspaper, Japanese officers ate human flesh in small pieces because they believed it was good medicine for the stomach. 2. Sun Gun. A Life magazine article published in 1945 detailed the absurd German plan to build a giant mirror in space in order to harness the power of the sun so they could burn specified focal points on the Earth's surface. In this article, it says that Germany wanted to use this space weapon to burn entire enemy cities to ashes or boil parts of an ocean. The idea originated from Hermann Oberth in 1923, who was a well-known rocket scientist at the time. The weapon was planned to be over a kilometer, 0.62 miles in diameter, and it would have been powered by the sun's rays. A budget was even set at 3 million Reichsmark to develop the weapon, and it was calculated by Oberth that it would take an estimated 15 years to construct the machine. In order to create the sun gun, building material would have to be brought to space using rockets so they could be mounted onto the megastructure. The plans for the giant mirror were not discovered until 1945 by the victorious Allies, which said the space weapon would have orbited the Earth at a distance of about 35,785 kilometers, 22,236 miles. Fortunately, the plans were never fully brought into fruition, and if Hitler had things go his way, the world we know today could have been a totally different place. If the Nazi leader had gained access to such space weapons, he most certainly could have gained world domination. In this day and age, the use of such a device has no beneficial use for war or peacetime purposes, and we're very lucky that nothing of this nature has ever been created. 1. Exploding rats. Imagine you're a soldier during World War II and you come across a dead rat. In order to dispose of the disease-carrying rodent, you throw it into the fire to avoid contamination, and instead of the rat burning to ashes, it triggers a giant explosion. Seems far-fetched, right? But this was an actual plan created by British secret agents as a war tactic against their enemies. These so-called rat bombs never actually caused any explosions, and yet they were still considered to be a massive success for the Allies. The Germans actually intercepted the very first shipment of rats on their way to Britain, which caused them to become really paranoid that their country was already infested with booby-trapped rodents. This paranoia caused the enemy to spend a huge amount of money and resources in order to combat the invisible foe. They worked tirelessly to track down this army of deadly rats, when in reality, they never even existed. In 2017, one of these bomb-stuffed rats was sold by a French SOE, Special Operations Executive Agent, by the name of Maurice Ledan, for a total of $1,875. The man had apparently escaped in 1940 from then-occupied France and joined the Allied commando after arriving in Britain. This proves that this plan was a tactic intended to be used during the war. However, Germany caused their own demise, most likely saving Britain tons of money in production and execution. 8. The Battle of Manila. The Allied effort to expel the Japanese from the Philippines began in October 1944 and lasted until August 1945. During that time, American forces witnessed the most awful urban fighting throughout the entire war. It took place in the Pacific Theater in what's known as the Battle of Manila. The month-long skirmish began on February 3, 1945, when US troops approached Manila from all sides. It came as a surprise to General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who was the commander-in-chief of Japanese army forces in the Philippines. He had no plans to defend Manila because he couldn't provide for its 1 million residents and because the area contained large numbers of flammable wooden buildings. As the Americans advanced toward the city, Yamashita ordered his troops to destroy vital bridges and installations and then evacuate. But Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi had other plans. Ignoring Yamashita's orders, he ordered the 12,500 men under his command to set up defensive positions, cut down trees to form a runway, and prepare to fight. A growing number of Japanese troops resisted the Americans, who were aided by Filipino fighters. The worst fighting of the battle occurred during the Allied capture of a steam-driven power plant near the banks of the Pasig River, where most of the skirmish was fought. This photo was taken as members of the 1st Cavalry Division crossed the Pasig River into Manila. They were on their way to clear the historic Manila Hotel, which was soon under US control along with a local police station, 2 churches, Manila City Hall, and the post office. The Allies won the battle, but their victory came at the cost of massive military and civilian bloodshed, and the city was almost completely destroyed. 7. Bougainville Campaign. From 1942 until the war's end in 1945, Allied forces sought to recapture Japanese strongholds in the New Guinea region of the South Pacific. In November 1943, American troops landed at Cape Torokina in eastern Papua New Guinea. It was the first of 2 phases of the Battle of Bougainville, which was part of the bigger Solomon Islands campaign. US forces took the Japanese by surprise, making them initially unable to launch an air assault on the invasion fleet. But the Japanese put up a stronger fight than the Americans expected, and were able to send light cruisers and destroyers to attack the American transports. They were followed by several Japanese heavy cruisers. Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman had no heavy cruisers under his command to launch a counterattack with, so he ordered an airstrike, which failed to sink any Japanese ships but caused significant damage. The fighting continued over the following year. American soldiers were largely unaccustomed to the hot and humid conditions. Many died from malaria and other tropical diseases as they expanded their presence into the jungle. This photo, taken on March 16, 1944, shows an M4 Sherman tank nicknamed Lucky Legs II in the jungle at Bougainville. The Bougainville campaign was an Allied success for several reasons. For one, it isolated Japan's air and naval base at Rabaul, causing Imperial forces to expend more air power than they could afford to lose. And the 2 airstrips that Americans built at Torquemada made it possible to launch fighter-escorted bomber attacks against the Japanese at Rabaul and other bases in the region. 6. The Handshake of Torgau. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River in Germany near the small town of Strehla. The Americans came from the west as the Soviets advanced from the east. When they finally met, it meant that they had effectively cut Germany in two, marking a major step toward the end of the war. Over the next day, the Americans and Russians met at several more points along the river. This photo shows the moment U.S. Army Commander Emil F. Reinhardt and Soviet Commander Vladimir Rusakov shook hands at Torgau. In the days after the meetings at Elbe River, soldiers met in front of photographers for the official Handshake of Torgau. In one iconic image, Lieutenant Bill Robertson and Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko embrace in front of the US and Soviet flags. These photos not only mark an important milestone for the Allies, but also a rare moment of friendship between two antagonistic powers. The meeting at the Elbe River came as welcome news to American President Harry S. Truman and Joseph Stalin. Both leaders reminded their audiences that the war wasn't over yet, but that the end was near, and that the Allies would continue fighting to restore peace to the world. 5. Burying fallen soldiers. The deadliest conflict in world history, claiming between 50 and 56 million military and civilian lives. An estimated 405,000 American military members died during the war, and while this represented a small percentage of the total lives lost, it was still a massive number of deaths, still more than the US has ever lost in all other wars combined. During the conflict, the military banned the return of fallen soldiers' remains to the US from overseas in order to put all available resources into the war effort. Instead, they were laid to rest at temporary cemeteries throughout Europe and the South Pacific. This image shows the flag-draped caskets of fallen American soldiers as they're being transported for burial. It's unclear where the photo was taken or where the remains were buried. At the war's end, families were given the choice to either leave their loved ones at rest or to have their remains repatriated. Congress funded the controversial initiative, which was favored by many, while others felt it was wrong to interfere with the dead. The project got underway in 1947 and reunited hundreds of thousands of American families with their family members' remains. Each shipload of caskets carried the remains of thousands of troops. Once they arrived in the US, they were put on trains and transported to their final destinations. Do you think it's wrong to interfere with the dead? Tell us in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. Close call aboard the USS Enterprise. The American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise participated in the most major actions against Japan during World War II, more than any other US Navy ship. Its wartime service began during the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, when the vessel was on its way back to Hawaii from a supply delivery at Wake Island 2,500 miles away. The Enterprise was still about 250 miles, 402 kilometers west of Oahu when the attack occurred, but was able to send some of its aircraft to provide cover and fight back against the Japanese. Several months later, the ship's fighter jets participated in an Allied raid of Tokyo, known as the Doolittle Raid, followed by the Battle of Midway not long after. The Enterprise remained in the South Pacific throughout the rest of the war, sending planes into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Iwo Jima, just to name a few. This photo, taken on November 10, 1943, shows one fighter pilot's close call with death as he crash lands a smoking Grumman F-6F Hellcat onto the Enterprise. Lieutenant Walter L. Tuning Jr. can be seen climbing onto the aircraft to help the pilot, Ensign Byron M. Johnson to safety. Luckily, Johnson escaped without serious injury. This incident happened while the Enterprise was on its way to Makin Atoll, where the Battle of Makin took place from November 19th to the 21st. 3. Sheltering in the underground. Before the Germans embarked on an 8-month bombing campaign against the United Kingdom known as the Blitz, authorities discouraged civilians from sheltering inside London subway stations. According to Prime Minister Winston Churchill's secretary, John Colville, they were worried that people would be reluctant to leave, but they soon learned that they couldn't stop it from happening. When Herbert Morrison was appointed Home Secretary in October 1940, he changed the official policy to allow residents to set up camp inside the underground. Certain stations and an unused section of track were designated for civilian use. The shelters grew to include 79 stations, housing a total of around 177,000 people. Sheltering in the subway wasn't exactly a pleasant experience. Conditions were incredibly cramped, as this photo shows. A government circular discouraging people from camping in the stations issued before the policy was reversed quoted a woman named Evelyn Rose as saying that the stench was unbearable. She described it as so bad that she didn't know how people didn't die from suffocation. And the stations weren't as safe as people thought, and over 100 people died in bombings that penetrated the underground. But it was a lot safer than being at ground level during the Blitz. Of the more than 40,000 British civilians who were killed by the Luftwaffe during the war, most lived in London. The sense of looming danger was ever present, so people were quick to line up outside the stations long before they were allowed in each day at 4:00 p.m. 2. Approaching Omaha Beach. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops stormed the coast of Normandy, France, in a mission to free the country from Nazi control. Famously known as D-Day, it was one of the largest amphibious invasions in history. During the early morning hours, more than 21,500 paratroopers landed along Normandy's beaches to prepare for the arrival of the seaborne assault. Amphibious vehicles and landing crafts brought soldiers as close to the shore as possible before they disembarked and went straight into battle. The famous photo shows a US Coast Guard landing barge packed with American soldiers approaching Omaha Beach. These barges ferried back and forth across the English Channel, bringing one load after another of reinforcement troops. The soldiers in the image landed 2 hours late at 9:30 a.m. When they arrived at Omaha, they were under intense fire from the Germans. By then, an initial wave of Allied troops had landed, and the beach was scattered with fallen men. The water turned red as the carnage continued. This was the first combat that many young men saw, and for many of them, it was also their first time seeing death. But they didn't have time to think about the shock of what was happening before their eyes. They had a job to do, and it included trying to stay alive while looking out for their fellow soldiers who were also still alive. We'll never know what it was like to be in one of those landing crafts approaching the shore at Normandy. Looking at photos like this, one can only try to imagine what the soldiers who participated in D-Day thought and felt as they traveled straight into harm's way, knowing that they could lose their lives at any moment. The campaign was extremely successful, marking the beginning of the end of the war. But it came at a cost to the Allies, who suffered at least 10,000 casualties, with 4,414 confirmed dead. Many of the soldiers who died hadn't even reached land yet, or had just arrived at the beach. The 78,000 German troops in the area lost 1,000 men, and civilian casualties are estimated at 3,000. And while the operation failed to meet some of its objectives, including the capture of several Nazi-occupied coastal villages, the Allied victory paved the way for further action against the Germans in France. 1. Hitler's nephew joins the US military. In 1911, William Patrick Hitler was born to Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf Hitler's brother, and an Irish woman named Bridget Dowling in a house in England that was later destroyed during one of the Nazis' bombing raids. He was still a child when his father left him in England with his mother and moved back to Germany, where he met another woman and started a new family. William reconnected with Alois Jr. when he was 18. He went to visit his father, who took him to a Nazi rally. During a return visit to Germany in 1930, he met his uncle Adolf personally and received an autographed photo from him. The following year, William wrote some articles about Hitler. At the time, the eccentric dictator was still rising to power, and the public had become curious about who he was. Hitler didn't like how the articles turned out and reportedly ordered William to retract them. William's known connection to Hitler also made him an outcast in England. He was fired from his job and couldn't find another, so he went to Germany, where his uncle got him a job at a bank. Unsatisfied with that, William then became a car salesman. He didn't like that job either, so he wrote to Hitler threatening to expose embarrassing details about the family's past if his uncle didn't find better work for him. Hitler offered to give William a high-ranking job if he relinquished his British citizenship. Worried that his uncle had more sinister plans, William fled to Britain in 1938 and wrote an article claiming that Hitler's paternal grandfather was Jewish. He also continued to blackmail Hitler and tried to join the British military, but was turned away due to his family ties. William moved to the US and joined the Navy with President Franklin D. Roosevelt's permission. He served until 1947 and was awarded the Purple Heart for his combat service. After the war, he changed his last name to Stuart Houston to escape the unwanted attention he got for being a Hitler. He settled down in Long Island with his wife and had 4 sons, none of whom ever had any children of their own. From then on, William lived an ordinary civilian life out of the spotlight. He passed away in 1987. Thanks for watching. Did you know Hitler's nephew blackmailed Hitler himself? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.